we're brought to this question of indigeneity in the context of work that has been going on in wider networks that we're part of, looking at questions of the decolonial and of coloniality. And of course the question of coloniality plays in a very kind of controversial way within a Swedish context, because part of the self-understanding of the Swedish state historically has been that it was not an active player in the processes of colonization, which of course is a falsity, and it's something that has become increasingly part of the cultural and political consciousness of new generations of practitioners and scholars, that they begin to understand the integral role played by Sweden in the processes of colonization, in the ongoing processes of colonization. We see in the Gothenburg Biennial a very interesting piece of work examining the role of the Swedish arms trade in global processes of conflict, displacement, expropriation, and colonization. So we come to this question within the wider political context of changing understandings of contemporary Sweden, but we also come to it in the more focused questions where we've been looking at a series of conferences that have addressed the question of decolonizing the museum. And through these conferences, we have again been brought to the question of indigeneity. We have been very focused in our work here in the Academy on the question of segregation around migrant cultures. Gothenburg, as you know, is one of the most segregated cities in Northern Europe. And this focus on the question of migration has kind of triggered a dialectical thinking to look at the question of indigeneity, and particularly through the work of our colleague Sarah Tuck, who's unfortunately not here today because she's presenting at a conference elsewhere. But Sarah Tuck is our Hasselblad postdoctoral fellow, and she's been working on the question of drone vision. And in this context, she has been working with a number of different constituencies in Pakistan, in Cyprus, but also here in northern Scandinavia, working with the Sami. And so through this work, again, we've been brought to the question of how the focus on migration in some way necessitates a thinking of the question of indigeneity. But most importantly, what we were struck by was the ease with which the question of indigeneity was often dismissed as merely a resurgent essentialism. And this struck us as being particularly problematic reflex. And so we were interested to orchestrate a strand of the conference which would not be necessarily a kind of unfolding of any kind of expertise from here, but rather would be an engagement with colleagues to try and begin to open up this question and to consider how this question of indigeneity might be given the due weight and seriousness it requires, given the ongoing genocides, given the atrocities that unfold around the world and that are deeply, deeply implicated within the networks of capital and innovation that proceed from places like Northern Europe. So one of the things that we've tried to do in the screening program that runs parallel to today's session is to just indicate the volume of information and knowledge that is there to be taken serious if we simply open up to the possibility of witnessing and engaging in some form of solidarity with those who are engaged in the frontline struggles of the question of trying to preserve worlds, trying to preserve ways of living, ways of being that have been under sustained assault for centuries and that have been engaged in resistance, continuous resistance for centuries. So we're opening up to this question, but I do emphasize that we enter into it from a very modest and humble position of wishing to learn, wishing to open up something, and we do not claim to own this question, but simply to have come to this question. So that's the wider context for us here. There is, of course, much more interesting things in the world than our context. There is the fact that around the world today, some of the most important and the most vibrant mobilizations that are taking place along the front of Indigenous peoples' resistance to the expropriation of their lands, the expropriation of their cultural heritages, the expropriation of their ways of being. And this is something that we wish to signal a desire to enter into dialogue, maybe more importantly to enter into listening and beginning to understand something of this world. I'm going to invite my colleague Jason Bowman to introduce our first speaker, and I would imagine that Jason also has some reflections to offer on this question as well. In my rush to begin proceeding today, I forgot to introduce myself. So, my name is Mick Wilson, and I'm the head of the Academy here at Valhalla Academy of Arts. Oh, sorry. My name is Mick Wilson, and I'm head of the Academy here in Valhalla, and I'm also, together with Andrea and several others, part of the working group on the PARSE platform and journal. So I'd like to hand over to my colleague Jason Bowman, who's the director of our MA in Fine Art program here at Valhalla.
Thank you, Mick. Welcome, everyone. I wanted to tether on to some of the observations that Mick made. We're obviously delighted that Dylan A.T. has agreed to be with us today. And in that sort of notion of humbleness, he's one of a number of scholars and activists and practitioners who have visited Valhalla over the past 3 to 4 years, raising this question of attentiveness towards contemporary issues for First Nations and Indigenous people. So we have had the great opportunity to listen, to really actively listen to people experiencing epistemic violence, from Maori communities to the Sami First Nations people here in Scandinavia, to scholars from First Nations people both in Canada and in the United States of America, and to people from Polynesia. So I'm delighted to be able to continue that dialogue, which is taking place in a set of seminars on decoloniality organised by my colleague Shel from MENA, and through recently into a 3-day symposium 2 years ago, almost now, on decolonising museums, where one of our key speakers was one of Dylan's colleagues within this framework of his work, Gerald McMaster. I understand that everybody has biographies and abstracts within the web link. However, in this situation, I think it's actually very important that I take the time to speak Dylan's biography, so we have an awareness of what it is we're encountering, the scholarship that he has produced, the ways in which he has sought to address the political frameworks in which he's considered. So I am going to take some time to introduce him properly. Dylan A.T. is a Métis artist, activist and scholar. He is currently Director of American Indian and Indigenous Studies and Associate Professor in the Residential College in the Arts and Humanities at Michigan State University. Miner is also Adjunct Curator of Indigenous Art at the MSU Museum and a founding member of the Just Seeds Artist Collective. He holds a PhD from the University of New Mexico and has published approximately 60 journal articles, book chapters, critical essays, and importantly, encyclopedic entries. As was stated last night in Craig's keynote, the necessity to ensure that those encyclopedic frameworks exist, and so that we are able to resist and reject the question of these things don't exist, and there are a number of scholars who are making sure for us they exist. In 2010, Dylan was awarded an Artist Leadership Fellowship through the National Museum of the American Indian at the Smithsonian Institute. His book, Creating Aslan, Chicano Art, Indigenous Sovereignty and Low Riding Across Turtle Island, was published in 2014 by the University of Arizona Press. He is currently completing a book on contemporary Indigenous aesthetics and also writing his first book of poetry. In 2017, he held solo exhibitions in Ontario and at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Detroit, taught a course in ecology at Oxford School of Art and Artists Residency, and published an artist book with Issue Press and exhibited in group shows here in Scandinavia and Norway, in Ireland, Canada and the US. He is now working on multiple exhibition projects for 2018 and 2019, including his work in various collective projects. Importantly, he has recently commenced the Butagani Mini, the Drummond Island Land Reclamation Project. Expanding on the work of the Métis activists and cultural workers across the Métis Nation homelands on both sides of the US and the Canada border, the Drummond Island Land Reclamation Project will become a location for land-based and cultural knowledge sharing. This project connects with the knowledge of Dylan's ancestors and with, from, for, on the land. The Drummond Island Land Reclamation Project will be a gathering space and centre for harvesting, teaching, learning, sharing, making, doing, and being in ways that assert the ongoing presence of meta-knowledge and community on the Butagani Minis. Dylan E.T. Minor.
Thanks Mick and Jason and Andrea for the invitation to speak with you and participate in this wonderful gathering here and to engage in the conversation circulating around indigeneity. Before I start my talk, there's two things I normally do. I usually introduce myself in my traditional language. I'm not a fluent speaker, I'm a language learner, as many people are, because of ongoing settler colonial regimes and for other reasons. So two things I normally do is introduce myself in my language and also acknowledge the traditional peoples of the land I'm traveling on. I normally work and travel in settler colonial institutions that is on Turtle Island and North America and in other places that have been colonized, usually by European institutions and nation states and previous empires. Here, of course, further to the north, we have Sapmi, and I'm here in solidarity with Roma and Sami and understanding the struggles of migrant and people of color here in Sweden, and thinking about how much of my work in the US and in North America tries to engage with the relationship and the relationality between migrant struggles and indigenous struggles, and how in fact they're part and parcel to the very same settler colonial, capitalist colonial institutions, and therefore kind of in a Fanonian response, the reply of the colonized should be continental in its scope. To move back for a second, allow me to introduce myself in Michif. That's the language of the Métis. We often call ourselves Michifs as well, or the Cree refer to us as Otabamisiwak. That means the people without bosses. I take that very seriously, thinking about my existence and way of being in this world that is fundamentally about the destruction and elimination of hierarchies in all of its forms, in the way that ancestral practices would have done exactly that. I often use the term wisakode winimiwak in the plural, or for my own self, wisakode winimi in the singular masculine, to refer to myself and to our nation, and that comes from our Ojibwe and Anishinaabe cousins, and I've been told it means various things, but the people of the burnt wood, which has to do with historical practices and understandings of identity and nationhood. So I'll introduce myself in Michif as well as Anishinaabemowin. Tanishki Kiowa, Nimuyuayan, Dishinikashun Dylan Minor, Nimishum Tepwash Michif, Nimishum Tepwash Otabasiwak. Dishinikashun Dylan Minor, Kichigumi Niki Nikawiten, Michigan State University, Nidantoshka, Dulizan Fan Dayawawak. G. Panataran Banadangashi, Botagini Minis, Wasaksing, Shebeshakam, Red River, Minakawa Bamitan. So that was Michif, and it's an interesting language because linguists understand it to be, if you break it down, it brings together both Cree and French. It developed during the colonial processes in North America as Francophone speakers integrated into Cree and Anishinaabe communities, and a new language was born where verbs and verb structures come primarily from Cree and noun structures come primarily from French. This is fundamentally important because the language Michif also begins to understand the different ontologies between indigenous ways of being in the world and settler colonial and often European or Western ones which are about doing and being and processes, verb-based, and ones which are object-based. Ani buju nichi bimarisik bongieta godinita Anishinaabemowin Dylan Minor Indigenous Kashoginashimun Ninin Indora Musako de Winini Potagini Minis Minwa Wasaksi, Minwa Shebeshakam, Minwa Benidangashi, Onjaba, Mishomis. Michigan Nin in Donjaba, Nekwejon Hinda, Spartanishnabeg, Ninda Noki, Miigwech, Dizizabia. So what the process for doing this, although purely for kind of structural in a time like this and in a place that is multilingual, when you're operating in North America in a settler colonial context, in English-only context, this is about naming and calling and relating to one's ancestors in a very important way, particularly for generations of scholars, for activists, for artists who don't speak the language fluently. And so I do so as a way to name and call attention to my kin, to my ancestors, to a word, if you've read recent writings of mine, to my adisokanag. Adisokan is a word that means both ancestors and descendants. And what does it mean when we break down the linearity of colonial histories and start to understand that when I'm naming my ancestors, I'm also talking about my descendants, and that I'm not seeing the world as if the past is behind me and the present is in this moment with the future in front of me. That all of these are in fact intimately linked together at all times. The way I will work through the talk today, and I hopefully won't bore you, I was a high school debater, and if anyone knows debate practices in North America, you learn to speak as fast and as quickly as possible to give it as much shit as you can. I've tried to decolonize my way of speaking, yet like many, I have been unable to do so. So I'll probably, as we go, get faster and then slow and then faster, as I try to get far too much information into today's talk without putting you all to sleep. In some ways, I've divided the talk into a couple of sections. One, I'll tell you a little bit about myself to give context to the talk itself. That will be followed up by a conversation around pipes and pipelines and knives, giiwekii, which, as you'll learn, the word in the Ojibwe language for white people, for Americans, is giiwekii, which means the big knife people. And I've used that as a metaphor to think about the transitions in colonial processes in North America as we go from giiwekii, from big knife people to big pipeline people, and what that means for all of us throughout the world. So I'll give a little bit of background, go into this and actually read from a paper, and then talk a little bit about some artistic practices of my own as they relate to this larger concept of giiwekii, or in the, which would refer to he, she, or they. It's a non-gendered singular here, giiwekii, about returning to the land. The beautiful thing about Anishinaabemowin and Michif is that you can actually break these up, and if you're fluent speakers, you can make new words, which become these beautiful, long, poetic structures. And if anyone's interested, I have some small artist books with me, which are called Wawakeshi Anikubajana, which is talking about deer and ancestors. But going back to this word, the key at the end actually refers to the land, refers to the earth and the sacredness of earth. So when we're talking about returning to one's home, you're talking about returning to the land that you know sacredly and very intimately here. So, Nimuki, so I emerge. So as I mentioned before, in Michif and Anishinaabemowin, I am, and as Jason mentioned, I'm a Métis artist and scholar and activist. I was born in what is now Michigan, on the U.S. side of the U.S.-Canada border, kind of at the intersections of the borderlands between those two settler nation states. I descend from fur-trading Métis people, and while we don't use that word as much as others do, the word Métis actually comes from the French word meaning of mixed descent. And basically over the course of the early colonial period, Francophone and Anglophone fur traders married into Cree and Anishinaabe communities, and over the course of endogamous relationships, an entirely new Indigenous community, although understanding that Cree and Anishinaabe or Ojibwe peoples were our relatives, created our own form of governance, our own language, and our own cultural practices. So, and we saw ourselves as being historically and contemporarily as Otabamisiwa, the people without bosses. This is an image of my grandfather's grandmother and her mother, as well as what some call an octopus bag, others call in English a fire bag, some call a medicine bag, and these are kind of one of the well-known cultural practices and productions of Métis peoples. They kind of begin to symbolize who we are as a nation and become an extension of our own sovereignty. One of the things that I do as a scholar, as an artist, I start to think about cultural practices, artistic practices, aesthetic choices and practices as assertions of non-Western forms of sovereignty, understanding different forms of polity based on cultural expressions. And so this particular fire bag here is still within my family, and the art historian, the Métis scholar of Indigenous women's work, Sherry Farrell-Rissette, who teaches in universities on the Canadian provinces, or prairie provinces, talks about, or has talked to me about the importance of this bag in particular, in that usually you know the men who use the bags. In this case, this is probably one of the earliest iterations that we know the woman who made it. So thinking about those practices and the importance of this object still being in my family. To give geographical context, this is the area where we'll be talking about the ovular object here, the oval, I guess, is the historic homelands of the Métis Nation. We were a mobile and moving community, kind of at the intersections of again, the nation-state borders between the US and Canada, and that circular image is where my family has, for the last few generations, kind of existed and worked and resisted colonialism. Now, in the conversations and as Mick set up before my talk, starting to understand indigeneity and its relationship to countries in Europe that didn't actively participate in settler colonial projects is a little more difficult to do. But when we start thinking about diasporas and migration and immigration and emigration practices of Scandinavia and other countries, we can actively put all of us in conversation. So my mom's family are actually of Swedish and Danish descent who ended up in Minnesota, going back to this, so kind of on the western edge of that circle there, who arrived in North America in the late 19th century. And much of these diasporas happened because of a variety of push-pull practices. But one of the things we know is that throughout the 19th century, Indigenous peoples were being pushed off their lands, pushed further west, placed on reservations or reserves, and in fact, mass murdered. And so the largest mass execution in the United States happened in 1862 in a mass hanging in Mankato, Minnesota called the Dakota 38+2. So it is inconsequential that this particular mass execution of 38 Indigenous individuals happens at the exact same year that the Homestead Act is passed. And the Homestead Act basically allowed settlers to come in and get access to 40 and then 80 acres of land, particularly in the areas that were and are Indigenous lands. And so here we can actually see my mother's family's homestead in Minnesota. They arrived about a decade or so after the passing of the Homestead Act, coming from this area around here. But the very ability for them to have access to land was enabled by genocidal processes of settler colonialism. And the relationship between that violence and what we see today in North America is very salient. Well, I don't usually talk about this, but today is the 132nd anniversary of the execution of Louis Riel. Louis Riel was, some of us refer to him as le chef métis, which in Michif, I mean, if you speak French, you probably could make that one out, the Métis, the Michif chief. He led two armed rebellions against what was England and then the Dominion of Canada in 1860s and 1880s, and then in 1885, on November 16th of 1885, he was hanged for that insurrection and the creation of a homeland for Métis peoples. This is an image of 3 artworks that I've made where these are large, about 2 meters by 2 meters. They have, this is kind of cutouts of birch bark or wigwas. These are called wigwas manidug, or birch bark spirits. And these are historic photographs of Riel. The one on the left is the Métis Provisional Government. The one in the middle is him, Riel when he's in prison, and then the one on the right is the trial where he is then ordered to be executed. So his body is being shadowed or hidden by these birch bark spirits, and then below those are the contemporary Google Earth images of those same locations where they happen. Thinking about the transition from Indigenous lands to parking lots. That middle one is actually a Parks Canada site, and then of course a street. So today is particularly right to have this conversation, thinking about the role that Louis Riel played in the understanding of our own sovereignty and resisting the Canadian and American nation states and what that means. So, as I had said, looking at images, my family have historically crossed those US-Canada borders, and my work thinks through and engages with the role that the violence of settler colonial borders play on Indigenous people. And my partner's family, they were Mexican-American migrant workers whose ancestors go back kind of to what are called Genízaro, or Indigenous Spanish-speaking peoples of Texas and New Mexico, and on the other side of the US-Mexico border, and then through other 19th century land expropriation from Native peoples, kind of began to become agricultural workers and moved throughout the United States. As somebody who understood my own family's story of indigeneity and the violence of the border, as well as that, having grown up within a Mexican-American and Chicano farm worker community, thinking about the way that the borders actually become violent to the ongoing practices, particularly I've been thinking about lately, harvesting and ways of relating to the land. The images here are basically the maps created to identify the new territories created after the 1814 Treaty of Ghent, which solidified what is now the US and Canada border, and to the right, the map attached to the 1848 Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which basically acquired half of Mexico for the US, and you can see that new boundary. But as I believe it was Andrea last night said, no, I think it was Ingrid maybe, that borders are porous. And settler borders, although inflict very real violence on us as human beings, nonetheless, those borders are permeable in some ways. So I want to show these images here because on the left-hand side, this is an island, series of islands, but on the left-hand side, what is marked as St. George's Island, which for Native peoples is known by the equivalent in English of Sugar Island, or the place where maple sugar is made, because its use was to harvest maple sap and make sugar there every year. But there's a number of historians who are looking at the way that this particular island in the St. Mary's River, right at the border between the US and Canada, was never in fact ceded. That it wasn't accounted for in any of the treaties, and therefore it should still remain under Indigenous Anishinaabe control. This is important because for traditional stories for Anishinaabe peoples, we talk about the migration, the way that people got to the Great Lakes. And as the story goes, basically, people were told by Giiwekii that they would kind of migrate west down the St. Lawrence River from what is the Atlantic Ocean into some lakes, and then they would know they'd found where to stay when they encountered food growing on the water, which, if anyone knows wild rice, or what we call manomin, it's basically an aquatic grass that is a significant part of Great Lakes Indigenous foodways. And so in this story, there are tellings of 7 sacred stops on this migration. And what is now Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan, and Ontario, US and Canada, is historically a place called Bawating, and it is one of those 7 sacred stops. The image on the right is around the same area, and you can actually see on the right, you can see where Sugar Island is indicated on the very top there. This is a Google Maps Earth image of the northern tip of the state of Michigan, where the Great Lakes are. So I'll go back just to give us some visual context here. So we're kind of at the top. I don't have a pointer, but if I did, we're kind of in the middle of that, where the two hands of the two peninsulas of Michigan intersect. So we can see how this border goes around Drummond Island. My family was on Drummond Island in the early 1800s and had fought with the English against the Americans. And because of that, fighting with a variety of other Métis and Anishinaabe peoples, when the Treaty of Ghent was signed, you can see that the border kind of juts around this island as a form of punishment for those native folks that fought there, and everyone was forced off the island, moved westward across Lake Huron, across the Georgian Bay to a community known as Penetanguishene. We can also see that island there on the right, Manitoulin Island, is the world's largest freshwater island. And this archipelago, that's another sacred space for Indigenous peoples of this area. And then finally, just to put some of the 19th century context to what we're talking about here, this is also where I live. And you can see this is between 1807 and 1842. There were a series of 8 named treaties signed between the US federal government and Indigenous nations. And if you look at the map, each of the numbered sections with a different pattern indicates the territory that was ceded in these treaties, or at least as the settler government argues was ceded in these treaties. When you look at, and scholars have done this, when you look at the different understandings of the treaty process, it wasn't, for many Indigenous folks, it wasn't about forever giving land away. It was about use value and expectations of shared exchange. So much of this becomes important because as we talk about relationships with land, access to food, access to harvesting, access to water, whether or not people can engage in traditional practices becomes quite important. Okay. So at this time I'm going to start to read and to talk about pipes and pipelines and knives and John Berger. So this is a story about images and their meaning. This is a story about stories and a story about beings. It is about pipes and pipelines. It is about oil and not about oil paintings. It is fragmented and disjointed. It is a needed intervention for our fossil fuel addicted economy. The story, however brief, is about the ways that colonialism and capitalism, as intertwined and immutable, continue to extract so-called resources while enacting violence to Indigenous peoples and simultaneously Indigenous ways of being and ways of knowing. It is about how images and the humans that create them participate in and reproduce these violent and unwieldy processes. It is about images and stories as living and sentient beings. Most importantly, the story, which masquerades as a lecture at an academic conference about art as research, is about mukumanan, the Anishinaabe or the Anishinaabemowin or Ojibwe word for knives. So it's about knives and pipes, both those ceremonial pipes used to communicate with the ancestors and the spirits, as well as those pipes that transport the bodies of dead beings and whose oil destroys the earth. The Anishinaabemowin word for medicine is mishkiki, a word that some have translated to mean strength of the earth. Yet on the heels of the violence enacted at Standing Rock and many centuries of settler colonialism, not to mention the apocalyptic futures that climate change lays bare, I wonder how we heal ourselves and the land when our mishkikiwan, that is our earth-based medicines, disappear. Through this brief lecture, I've only begun thinking through and talking about knives and pipes, and as such, these spoken words you hear today are only preliminary. But like any story, it is not fixed, and as such, we can without a doubt shift and transform and shape the narrative in ways that direct us towards better and more sustainable futures, ones which are always intimately tied to the past. The words that you hear today and the ideas they communicate are as simple, as you can see here, deba giiwekii, that is a narrative, a non-sacred narrative. They are not an arisokan, which is a sacred story. This is crucial yet difficult distinction. I've heard some argue that the arisokanat, that are these sacred stories, described in many ways, which include traditional or sacred stories, they are sometimes referred to as myths or legends, although for many Indigenous peoples, myself included, we're not found in the ways that these two concepts diminish the importance of the arisokanat. I've been told that the arisokanat are those stories that are so significant that they become living and sentient beings and know that they are being told. For many, the belief that some stories, the exquisite accumulation of words strung together to create multi-dimensional meaning, the belief that these stories are living can be both a marvelous yet troublesome proposition for those whose ontology is firmly positioned in the rationalist epistemologies of Western ways of being. Back on Turtle Island, those indigenous lands of North America, the Arisokanat are stories who are also living beings. These stories/beings become alive through the process of being told. We tell them into being. As human animals, we tell these stories into being. As both an historian of art as well as an artist myself, I'm particularly interested in these stories, these beings we call art, and the relationship between art and research. But the words in the page, or the words that you hear and the story they communicate, and the story it communicates today, is not a sacred story. It is an accessible narrative. It is the Bajimoin, which you see here behind me. However, I wonder if this anti-colonial and capitalist story that I'm telling today, and if I tell it in a good way, if it too will know it is being told and in turn become a sentient being. Can all our stories become beings? Is all this knowledge sacred? Is all art research? As artists and creators, as arts educators, how do we braid together our precious words like the strands of wingush or sweetgrass? And for many peoples in kind of the Great Lakes region in the middle of North America, or Turtle Island, you'll see sweetgrass braids. Sweetgrass is just a natural grass. It smells sugary and sweet when it grows in the field, and then when you burn it as a smudge or as an incense, and then purify the space, it creates a sweet smell. It's one of 4 sacred medicines. And there's some who argue that the reason that many indigenous people in North America braid their hair is to replicate the braiding of the sweetgrass, which, as I understand it, means the hair of Mother Earth. So when we're braiding the hair of other humans, we're actually participating in a process that links us back to the earth. So when you braid your own hair, or your child's, or your partner's hair, you're actually participating in a way of taking care of the earth and remembering that process. So as artists and creators, how do we braid together our precious words like the strands of winglish or sweetgrass? How do we make beings from our stories? How do we prevent the ongoing ecological destruction of indigenous territories and the spirits that inhabit them? Over the past years, I've watched the increasing violence against indigenous, Black, Latino, immigrant, trans, queer, and female bodies and communities. I wonder how better understanding the history of art and telling stories about it facilitates the dismantling of systems that are intimately linked with art. By thinking about knives and pipelines and John Berger, I hope to offer this giiwekii, this narrative, as possible seeds whose sowing and harvesting and dissemination are beyond my own control. Maybe it is my academic lineage and kinship, having studied under Marxist art historian David Craven, but I've always been drawn to the work of art historian John Berger, whose ways of seeing, both the book and the BBC television program, were fundamentally important and overly simplistic. At the beginning of the 4-part BBC program from 1972, Berger systematically removes a utility knife from his back pocket. Wearing blue pants and a striped shirt with a butterfly collar, hair oddly messy, clearly a cool dude in 1970s England, Berger methodically cuts through the canvas of Sandro Botticelli's Venus and Mars from circa 1483. Berger's mukuman, that is Berger's knife, travels in canvas to remove Venus' head. As an art historian myself, albeit an historian of Indigenous arts of the Americas, I cannot decolonize the thousands of Western paintings and sculptures in my mental archive. As Berger cuts, I immediately think to myself, ce n'est pas un pipe. That must not be a pipe. And my mind quickly goes to René Magritte's La Trahison des Images, The Treachery of Images, from 1928 and 29. If Magritte's pipe is not a pipe, then Berger's Botticelli is neither Venus nor Botticelli. Just as Berger hopes I will, I start to develop the distinction between a work of art and its reproduction. I quickly think about the intimate relationship between art and artifice. But maybe I shouldn't care. Maybe I should. In my mind, Magritte's surrealist pipe, or rather following the logic of Berger that Berger establishes, that is, mental images of digital reproductions of photographs of paintings of pipes. So, in my mind, these mental images of digital reproductions of photographs of paintings of pipes transform and become George Catlin's portfolio of pipes from 1852. Catlin was the quintessential colonialist American painter, whose 19th century paintings participated in a sort of salvage ethnology. According to Catlin himself, his work was intended, quote, to rescue from oblivion their primitive looks and customs, end quote. Founding director of the National Museum of the American Indian, W. Richard West from the Southern Cheyenne Nation, notes that Catlin is, quote, a cultural P.T. Barnum, a crass huckster trading on other people's lives and lifeways, end quote. I care little about Catlin as an artist, but in addition to painting, quote, primitive looks and customs, end quote, he also painted pipes, the sacred ones that are smoked in ceremonies or used to mark significant events, those like that are seen here. He painted the pipes whose smoke communicates with the spirits and the ancestors and with the Creator. These objects are sacred. They have a function. In an obviously settler colonial tradition that cannot be invented, as one might say on social media, you can't make this shit up. The reddish-brown, fine-grained sedimentary rock used to make pipe bowls, like you see here, a material that I would call miskatwaglasan, or red pipestone, is commonly known as capitalism. It is named after the artist who, quote-unquote, discovered it. Catlin painted 19th century Indigenous people and their practices, and now the red pipestone used by many Indigenous peoples and communities bears his name. As for me, I'm interested in Catlin solely because he painted pipes and participated in salvage ethnology, believing that his work as an artist was, quote, to rescue from oblivion their primitive looks and customs, end quote. While Botticelli's Venus and Mars is housed in the National Gallery in London and recognized as a true work of art, Catlin's portfolio of pipes is located in the British Museum, a work of cultural history. But as I speak, and as you listen, don't forget that in this talk at least, we should still be thinking about John Berger's ways of seeing, even if our minds are drifting across a series of image-based discourses. As I drift further away from Berger and his violent engagement with Botticelli's paintings, I move beyond Catlin's paintings and migrate towards those of Swiss artist Peter Rindesbacher, and the paintings he made of what he called half-casts around Red River, Manitoba, which is contemporary Winnipeg, Manitoba. These images, such as this one here, were painted around the same time that my Anishinaabemowin, my grandfather's great-grandmother, was born in this very location. Rindesbacher painted lots of people smoking pipes. That is to say, he painted lots of Indigenous people smoking pipes. He painted Métis voyageurs smoking small clay pipes in their Hudson's Bay canoe. He painted a Métis woman, such as the one we just showed here, smoking a long pipe while carrying a baby in a tikanagan or cradleboard. He smoked Indigenous folks. He painted Indigenous folks smoking outside in a variety of environments, and people smoking inside teepees. He loved painting people in their pipes. He even painted a self-portrait that we see here of himself smoking a pipe. And the image on the right is one that I made during DAPL, kind of as a meme referencing this. So during autumn 2016, at the height of the resistance to the Dakota Access Pipeline and associated issues at Standing Rock, I employed this image as source material to quickly create an anti-DAPL meme. The text of the image reads, "The only pipeline that I support doesn't transport oil." So I hope you're still with me at this point, but I imagine pipes and ceremony, and then my mind goes immediately to pipelines, and the intimate relationship between extraction and the ongoing dispossession of Indigenous peoples. I think about the Dakota Access Pipeline and fossil fuel extraction as contemporary manifestations of the Indian Removal Acts. In the 19th century, the discovery of oil in Oklahoma, what was then called Indian country for much of the 19th century, was linked to extra-legal dispossession of Indigenous land bases. We must remember that current President Donald Trump desires to be Andrew Jackson, if you follow some of his ideas. Sometime in the last year, Trump tweeted his unofficial form of presidential communication about Andrew Jackson in a way that demonstrated a form of colonial amnesia and revisionist historical memory. For Indigenous peoples, the linkages that Trump makes to Jackson are not coincidental. After all, it was Andrew Jackson who initiated the Indian Removal Act on May 28, 1830, and it was Trump who signed the executive order on January 24, 2017, only a few days after entering office, approving the completion of the Dakota Access Pipeline. So these are two images, works I made. One is Andrew Jackson. This is on the dollar bill. So I isolated his image from the dollar bill, obscuring the eyes. Pipelines are contemporary Indian removal acts, and this is its parallel. also two other works. Much of my work integrate Anishinaabemowin into the visuals, sometimes translated, such as here, Gawin Trump Aswid Gichi Gima Anishinaabemowin. Trump's not the president, this is Indigenous land, or Trump kind of drinking, sucking, doing whatever he does to oil. But have you forgotten, and I think I have at this point in the story, that as I write, I'm still watching and thinking and engaging with John Berger's ways of seeing. Don't ask me why, but I am. And Berger's voice of God narration interrupts the sound of the knife slicing through Botticelli's canvas. The sound of the knife punctuates my own thoughts and slices them as well. I no longer care at this point, or maybe I never did, about Botticelli or Europe or even our history as a discipline. But I am still very much concerned about pipelines and colonization and extraction and settler colonial institutions. In this moment, watching and thinking and for some reason engaged with ways of seeing, and in this durational moment that I write this story down, or today as I speak it to you, Berger and his words become the impetus for me to think through an anti-colonial and Indigenous art history and bring Berger's own Western Marxism forward 45 years, while simultaneously linking it backwards to time immemorial and engaging with the unique variant of settler colonialism that we see in North America, as well as integrating Indigenous and Indigenous studies perspectives. In his obituary for the BBC, Will Gompertz writes that Berger, quote, had the eye of an artist, intellect of an academic, and charisma of a born performer. He was above all, a writer and storyteller. He enriched our lives with his novels, poetry, and criticism. He showed us how to see, not as individuals, but together, end quote. But Berger's thoughts were inextricably linked to British and Western Marxisms and unable to fully integrate non-Western ontologies. To borrow from Berger himself, quote, tonight, or this morning, it isn't so much about the paintings themselves which I want to consider, as the way we now see them. Now in the second half of the 20th century, move us forward to the 21st century, because we see these paintings as nobody saw them before. If we discover why this is so, we shall also discover something about ourselves and the situation in which we are living, end quote. So this image here that you see is only a few seconds into the four-part series. The narrator speaks and asks us, the audience, to consider how we understand the process of vision. Berger, as both voice of God, narrator and protagonist, as both critic and poet, inquires us to discover why we see these paintings like no one has before, discovering something about ourselves in the process. By doing so, and evoking the language of discovery, however, Berger evokes the same colonial process of claiming and naming that his critique potentially lays bare. I'm less interested in discovery per se than I am with merging Berger's ideological critique of capitalism with the potentiality that Indigenous ontologies have to challenge the omnipotence of capitalist violence. I am more invested in dismantling institutional extraction than I am with academic exploration. From Berger, however, I learned to revel in the disavowal of disinterest. If images have agency to act upon us in certain ways, why should we not reciprocally act on them from partisan positions that are at least not impartial? Both Berger and I are, I think, disinterested in the paintings themselves. Rather, Berger wants us to question some of the assumptions we have about European painting, a tradition which he notes died around 1900. Berger and his many peers on the left recognize that the periodization of European painting intimately coincides with the age of empire and the expansion of capitalism. All of these are interrelated. Unlike painting, though, colonialism has not ended. Colonialism did not, and has not ended, and did not end in 1900. Rather, as Dapple so horrifically illuminates, colonialism continues in an unfettered, if contested, trajectory. Nijo mukamana, 2 nines. Botticelli's Venus and Mars is conveniently housed in the National Gallery, London, which is significant for Berger's story, less for mine. I recall as an undergraduate art student, back before I had children and back when I was a little younger, I remember falling asleep through many of the long and boring lectures on Renaissance paintings. Hopefully no one here has ever fallen asleep in an art history lecture. Or during mine today. As an art student, as I still do today, I often wondered how art historians could do such violence to images by rendering them, how do you say, boring. During a typical lecture with the lights dimmed to near darkness, the hum of the slide projector turned digital projector only served as the music to the art history's lullaby. If Berger's knife was a provocation, then the art history was grievance. I never met Berger in real life, but in my viewing of a digital production of a video cassette of the 1970s BBC television series, I knew that John Berger rocked a butterfly collar, and he had little concern for the necessary distance between a work of art and its viewer. He was willing to take up a knife and, even if only disfiguring a reproduction, destroy a work that others held in high regard. Each time I watched the opening scene of Ways of Seeing, and its many dozen times at this point, I smile as if Berger's knife literally undoes the economic and colonial legacy that is objectified in the history of Renaissance painting. How many times have I fantasized about doing exactly what he does? Berger's knife and words and images serve to dismantle or at least illuminate those institutions of oppression, heteropatriarchy, class division, sexism, racism, colonialism, ad infinitum. Those same institutions that I wanted to smash. I cannot help but think about Berger's knife as both metaphor and symbol. Hopefully now that the paper gets a little more interesting. For this work, as an art historian, Berger's writings, like the knife, was similarly sharp. Like Berger, I also wield a pocket knife, though mine is not red. Mine is black and silver, and like Berger, I too remove it from my pocket before I cut into priceless objects. But my mukuman, my knife, does work dissimilar to that of Berger's knife. My knife does not slice canvas to remove and isolate the heads within canonical masterworks housed in one of the great museums of the world, whose collections were pillaged through European colonial expansion. No, my mukuman, my knife, is not an analytical tool to understand Benjaminian theory, the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction, or, if you've read it more recently, the work of art in the age of technological reproducibility. My knife does, however, serve a similar function in that it pierces through the outer bark of the birch tree to harvest wigwas, the Anishinaabemowin word for birch bark. My mukuman is both theoretical and practical, maybe going back to Craig Wilkins' talk last night. It links what I do in the academy with what I do in the bush. My knife is about returning to the land and about collaborating with the plants. So this image here is my annual harvesting trip with an elder, Howard Kimawan. With my left hand, I gently remove a sema or tobacco from my pocket and offer this to the ancestors and to the tree. I conjure the spirits with an attempt at a song before making a small and delicate incision, testing if this particular wigwasidag or birch tree is ready to share its bark. If the time is right, I make a vertical incision down the tree. Next, I slowly insert the tips of my fingers, feeling the moisture under the bark, and gently begin to remove the outer bark from the wigwasidag, making sure not to damage the tree. If the time is right, and this should be done at the precise moment during the year, the wigwas removes itself. It creates a thunderous boom, echoing the sounds of late summer storm as it peels itself off the tree. And as I hear this sound, I think about the stories and connect me to the birch tree. And there's stories that are told about how birch trees got the lines on them, which have to do with lightnings. So when you actually harvest and hear the sounds that are made, there's a reciprocal relationship between these stories, which removed from the context, make less sense. With moistened fingers, the sweet scent, like an only to a late season watermelon, permeates the air, and I think of tree and land and ancestors. I think of the generations who have harvested bark to make canoes and makakun, that is baskets. If this process is done properly, the tree will scar, but it will survive. When harvesting and throughout the year, I will a mukamanens, that is a small knife. Small knives are precious and intimate and do certain kinds of work. They do kinds of work that the giiwekii, that is the big knives, cannot do. So here I'm doing a critique of colonialism, the logics of whiteness and settler colonialism with the giiwekii, and then thinking about small, intimate, precious knives as being something else. And when you kind of put an ent at the end of a word, it's a diminutive that talks about being small but also being loved. So that kind of plays going out. Like Berger, my knife does its work in an esteemed site of social and cultural importance. In Anishinaabemowin, the lingua franca of the Great Lakes Indigenous world, the term for an American or a white person is giiwekii. Literally, the term translated is someone who carries a big knife. And in an Indigenous worldview, colonial agents carried and wielded big knives in their assault on Indigenous sovereignties, epistemologies, and ontologies. I'm certain that not much has changed in the centuries of colonialism. Thinking about this today, I'm still convinced that it should, in the sentences above, use the present tense of the term, of the verb to carry and to wield. But this is one of the dilemmas of English and most European languages. It creates a linearity of verb tenses, past, present, and future. So you don't have that same breaking down. When you say giiwekii, you're not putting it in the past or someone that carried or wielded past tense or future tense. It's just a tense of being. As carriers of small knives, both Berger and I challenge the giiwekii, that is, so now I'm creating a word that talks about the knowledge of kind of American settlers. That is capitalist, colonial, and heteropatriarchal ontologies. Our knives, mine and Berger's, are both small knives. So just some of the processes that small knives have us do. These are some of the things I've harvested. This word you see here, aki-gikendamowin. Aki is about land and territory, in relationship with that land and territory. People generally translate gikendamowin as knowledge, but it's a living form of knowledge. These are some of the, my great-grandmother was an herbalist and a midwife and had some of this knowledge, but through colonial processes that disappears. So as an artwork you'll see later, I've been engaged in a project to reclaim and to practice some of these knowledges. So these are some of the things I've harvesting last spring. You can see these are ramps in the basket, and then those flowers on the right are something called bloodroot. And there's kind of documents of my great-grandmother making a dark salve as this healing medicine, and my guess is it comes from that particular plant. Some of the things made from the wigwas, from the birch bark, some baskets. This one in the middle here is a birch bark biting. These are all objects that I've made and conduct workshops and sessions with youth on. According to Wikipedia, the knowledge of all things, there's less than a dozen people that practice birch bark biting through relations and networks. We put a list of probably 2 to 3 dozen people that are still engaged in this practice globally. It's a small number, but and basically what it is you separate the different layers of the birch bark and then fold it and then bite into it and create patterns as a way of making marks. The bracelet there is made with porcupine quills, cordage made from the basswood tree. That split pole is it's a push pole for harvesting wild rice, and then some etched birch bark. And this is our annual sugar bush. Okay. If giiwekii is used to describe those who throughout the colonial period wielded the power of settler colonialism, it is possible that our Anishinaabemowin that is, those descendants and ancestors, a word that means both at the same time, will call those who benefit from this moment in time giiwekii, that is big pipelines. So if giiwekii meant white people, Americans in the 19th century, I'm arguing that settler colonial institutions and North American capitalists will better be known as giiwekii. If early colonialism was a violent task wielded by the weapons of war, today's colonial project is maintained through state-sanctioned and market-based weaponry. But these are similarly used to dismantle Indigenous sovereignty and relationships to the land. These weapons are not better, only contemporary weaponized practices intended on appropriating Indigenous lands and enacting genocide against Indigenous peoples. As David Blackman wrote for Forbes this past April, quote, so this is Forbes, it's a kind of a capitalist publication, DAPL has already begun to improve the economics of drilling for and producing oil from the Bakken Shale, whose rig count has begun to rise over the last few months. And while the aggressive and often violent protesters, who spent half a year opposing the project's completion, would never admit it, DAPL is already improving the safety of moving Bakken crude oil out of the basin and to be sold and refined, end quote. Well, I disagree with Blackman's accounts of the water protesters as so-called aggressive and often violent. You can see here the protesters being aggressive and violent. We can nevertheless see that the Indian Wars, that was what the US government called kind of the violent manifest destiny against Indigenous populations. We can see that today the Indian Wars continue. This is not about the safety of moving oil, but rather the ontological and epistemological desire to do so. And of course, in addition to this, there's also the epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, trans, and two-spirit folks on both sides of the US and Canada border, and the relationship between sexual and other forms of violence as it's related to the extraction of oil. There's a mainstream Hollywood film, quite problematic, called Wind River, which engages with this, even if it's a quite problematic film. In Canada, a nation state where Indigenous issues are more visible than in the US, yet where Indigenous peoples consider themselves to live in apartheid-like conditions, Native communities are supposed to have free, prior, and informed consent before mineral extraction processes occur. Yet as we saw in early 2007, earlier this year, Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau said that Indigenous peoples, particularly in reference to the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, which are around Vancouver, British Columbia, and oppose pipelines, quote, this is what Trudeau says, no, they don't have a veto power. Trudeau subsequently approved the Trans Mountain Pipeline. Current pipelines under development to move shale gas include Energy Transfer Partners LP's Rover Pipeline, TransCanada Corp's Leach Express, and William Koss Inc.'s Atlantic Sunrise. Extractive industries, the relationship to the ongoing appropriation of Indigenous lands, and the creation of new pipelines to move gas and oil is one of the most pressing environmental and political issues today. Of course, Indigenous resistance is not going to stop. We have gone from big knives to big pipelines. Colonial violence has just changed. And these are some images that I've made and circulated against extraction. I'm just going to toggle through them. So where I live, and you can see the shape of the state of Michigan, kind of where the Great Lakes are, which have a significant amount of the world's freshwater surface water. Between, kind of through the Straits of Mackinac, there's a pipeline called Enbridge Line 5, which has been there for over 50 years. It isn't being monitored appropriately, and if it does, and it will leak, it will kind of totally decimate Lake Huron and Lake Michigan. And there's another extractive process near me as well called the Back 40 Project, which is near Menominee sacred sites. And having worked with community members, this was the initial image I made, and then altered it in conversations with them. So I got about 2 more paragraphs of reading, and then I'm going to show a few images, and then I should be at the end here to open up for dialogue and conversation. If John Berger taught me to read oil paintings to understand the machinations of capitalism, as well as the functions of cisgendered male gaze, it is our task at this moment to read oil and the machinations of settler colonialism. So if Berger taught us to read oil paintings, I'm saying we need to learn to read oil. As Eve Tuck and Kay Wayne Yang so forcefully write, quote, "Decolonization brings about the repatriation of Indigenous land and life. Decolonization is not a metaphor for other things. Other things we want to do to improve our societies and schools," end quote. So as we engage in conversations around decoloniality, around decolonization here at this conference, I want you to remember what Tuck and Yang argue: decolonization is not a metaphor. We're talking about something very different here. In the Great Lakes, where I make my home and where my paternal ancestors fought with the British against the giiwekii and were forced to the other side of the lakes, we faced the potential oil spill of Enbridge Line 5, an aging pipeline that was built in 1953. The pipeline moves oil from Western Canada through Wisconsin across the Straits of Mackinac into Sarnia, Ontario, Canada. Anishinaabemowin activist Vanessa Gray has brought attention to the ecological violence enacted against citizens of Anishinaabemowin First Nation and their home in Canada's Chemical Valley. The struggles against pipelines and mineral extraction is not a new one, but Indigenous peoples are the most sacred, but for Indigenous peoples, this is the most sacred fight and one linked to sovereignty. Again, decolonization is not a metaphor. The economics of colonial extraction continue full force. The logics of settler coloniality are unrepentant. And in response, I wield a mukumanens, that small life, and use it accordingly. Let me just talk about two ways that, two returning to the land. This is a diagram just thinking about the big knives of settler colonialism as it functions. So in this diagram, I've tried to indicate, if inadequately, the way that the big knives of settler, the totality of Indigenous ontologies and ways of being. So you can see that the tips of this blade here are piercing through and also blocking and rupturing the ability for continuity of the system. We could look at various other elements in here, the way that the problematics and way that race plays itself out under colonial structures, settler colonial structures. We could also probably talk about other kinds of Indigenous relationships and practices that are severed through these systems, but by and large, I think that I call it the tripartite system, which is capitalism, heteropatriarchy, and colonialism, and the way that these three institutions and structures work together to reproduce the nation state and the various forms of hierarchies within them. So in response, much of my practice has turned to two different modalities, two different practices. One which I call the pedagogy of visiting, or the methodology of visiting. And a number of years ago, I was doing an oral history project with retired Native auto workers, and they said nobody visits anymore. That with urbanization, with colonization, with the realities of wage labor, that there isn't the same sort of relationship building that happened historically. So I started doing an ongoing project called The Elders Say We Don't Visit Anymore, and it's transforming mainstream institutions into temporary Indigenous spaces. Here you can see it happening in the Canadian Arctic, in the Yukon Territory, transforming this art gallery into a temporary visiting space, often circulating around shared tea and shared food. This is how it operated in Vancouver's downtown east side, which has one of the which is a heavily indigenous area, but it's also an area where you see lots of violence against indigenous women, but transforming the space, the gallery, into a momentary indigenous space, despite the existence of Gucci Mukuman governments. And the other one would be returning to the land, the title of the talk, giiwekii. And if I was to say I return to the land, I would say ne giiwekii. So I'm returning to the sacredness of land. As I've mentioned a bit so far, my grandfather's grandmother was known as an herbalist, and part of my practice has been to collaborate with plants, with knowledge keepers, but also collaborate with plants as sentient beings. If I'm thinking about stories and art as living beings, and I'm not doing this kind of as a metaphor, I'm doing this understanding them actually as alive and as sentient, I start to collaborate with the plants. And this is a project called Michif Michin. So in Anishinaabemowin, Ojibwe language, the word for medicine is mishkiki, that is the strength of the earth. In Michif, the word for medicine, in Michif, the language, the word for medicine is michin. So this project is thinking about the relationship between people and medicines. And I'm thinking about not medicines in a Western sense, but those totalities of plant knowledges that keep us and allow us to be healthy. So these are kind of a series of prints based on plants that I'll learn and collaborate with, and then harvest and make prints from them, and then print them in inks I make from berries I harvest. So unlike in many places in Scandinavia, where the expectation is that everyone has access to harvest berries on anyone else's private property, kind of the process of ownership in North America is very much privatized, and harvesting rights don't exist. So this is very much a decolonial project in a very non-metaphorical way, trying to relate to those plants and medicines in ways and in locations that may in fact be illegal to do so. Okay, so I don't have any concluding remarks, but rather I want to leave this as a space to end and to think about conversations in the ways that the indigeneity strand and the decolonization strand, and thinking about inclusion and exclusion all intertwined together. Something I didn't say in this is, particularly in North America, but in all settler colonial contexts, we see that while it's been a struggle for people of color, for migrant communities to be integrated, fully integrated in, while being able to assert traditional practices, settler colonial practices are fundamentally about kind of the inclusion of indigenous people as a way of disavowing sovereignty and disavowing nationhood and traditional knowledge forms. So we see that with kind of moving off of lands, taking of lands, creation of reservation systems. In the US, then it was kind of forcing people to reservations and forcing them to cities to work. Having blood quantum requirements in terms of tribal enrollment status. So if your parents were mixed descent, you would eventually be biologically ruled out. It was about the kidnapping of children and moving to boarding schools. All of these things were about integrating and including indigenous peoples, not as indigenous peoples, but as a way to undermine traditional forms of government and knowledge of ways of being in the world. So just to think about this as we're engaging in conversations about exclusion, what does that mean to forcibly and forcefully and violently be included in ways that remove you from your own community? So, Chimigwech, Marci, thank you, and love to engage conversation.
Thank you so much. We are, from the schedule, we're able to stay in this room now, right? Until 12 o'clock.
Yes, we can?
Yes, we can. And that was something you asked of me earlier on, whether we'd have to move rooms so we're able to stay here. And so we have some time to take comment, observation, question in relation to Dylan's presentation. Okay.
I have a question. Thank you very much for this really brilliant presentation, specifically because you had this connection to capitalism and the analysis that you brought that I think very key for us in Europe, especially for the privileged Europeans that we don't think about capitalism. I would have a question on the other side. I'm actually interested when you had all your references, and for example, when you come to the triadic forms of power and the relations to capitalism, you have capitalism, colonialism. So here, for me, came to my mind immediately the colonial matrix of power. That is, but it's not about this. And also when you talk about your work, that is very conceptual actually. And I was thinking why you make a recurse to to your sources, while other sources of conceptual art, I put some names like Adrian Piper, or if you think about the Chicano movement, Audre Lorde, so other elements to the present, for example, Black Lives Matter. And my question would be, because you didn't mention, but it is there, is this a question of different processes of discrimination? It means that historically it's actually already a division on these processes of rationalization, exploitation, that is necessary to have another strategy, or the other possibility will be your comment of analysis in terms of organizing a space of connection, building what is called, maybe it's too old already, but counter genealogies. So this will be open for me thinking about this, and I would like your comment.
Thank you. Lots of good connections and places to start there, and I probably won't get to all of that. For some reason, I just kept going back at this talk, in particular to John Berger. Most of my work doesn't even take into account Western thinkers in this way. I was trying to respond, at least when I initially wrote this. And the original context was presenting an earlier and kind of problematic draft at the Clark Art Institute in Western Massachusetts, which is a very stuffy old art history kind of center. And so it was trying to do an intervention there. But as I've been thinking, and again, this is responding to the fairly recent, at this point still, death of John Berger, and I think that he had some interesting thoughts on the world. So you're very right in terms of much of my other work doesn't engages more with Indigenous and Chicano scholars who are situated in Indigenous studies, and I think that's part of if you participated in the indigeneity strand, or read part of the introduction to my book project, or my first book, which was called Creating Aslan, Chicano Art, Indigenous Sovereignty and Lowriding Across Turtle Island, which is looking at post-1968 Mexican-American or Chicano practices. So, yes, I'm engaging with that work. I'm also, in some ways, responding to, you mentioned the coloniality of power, Anibal Quijano. I will say, and this would be a wonderful conversation to engage with here, but also think about these implications. There's been some tensions, I think, between what I would call the decoloniality clique, whether it's Quijano, Mignolo, and those folks understanding and engaging with decoloniality, and the positions and articulation between Indigenous artists, activists, scholars. And sometimes I think they're not speaking to one another, and other times I think there's some problematic. So that image actually comes from a longer thinking, and I just made the diagram last night, so it's not, probably lots of problematics, you can point them out. But there was a conference at the University of Toronto maybe 4 years ago at this time, called Decolonizing Aesthetics, or Decolonial Aesthetics. And it was organized by a number of Latino artists in Toronto, but who were working with Indigenous artists as well. And what developed there, and I've been thinking about and trying to grapple with, were the very real tensions between the discourses of decoloniality articulated, I myself am white-coded and exist in the world based on having white privilege, but the articulations of decoloniality by white and Latin Americans at elite institutions of higher ed in the US, and between the on-the-ground activism of Indigenous folks in the particularly in the global North, and there were some real tensions that were unresolved, and I've been thinking about these tensions for some time. But one of the positions that Indigenous folks were arguing was that not everything is within the coloniality of power, that there are moments and there are people and there are practices outside of that everything isn't within that matrix. So that image was in some ways responding to that. I would say that in North America, and particularly on Turtle Island, in the settler colonial context, and I can't think outside of the settler colonial context, and you can see, I keep coming back to it. Kimberly Crenshaw's notion of intersectionality, coming from a black feminist perspective and thinking about the relationality between colonial structures and between racist and gendered and heteropatriarchal structures are all linked together. So I think her work comes into play and is important as well. Did I get all of those? Is there some other elements that?
No, good, thank you. I mean, it's others said other questions, I just want. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, thanks very much. That was really amazing. I haven't formulated a question yet, but I've got a couple of observations, which is that I want to link so-called utopian socialism, and forgive me if I get this description wrong, but the description of your people as the people without bosses, is that right?
That's the way I translate it. People often translate it different ways.
Yeah. And David Craven. Okay, so what
people don't know David Craven. His most well-known work is called Art and Revolution in Latin America. In Latin America, kind of a heterodox Marxist art historian.
But he also wrote about abstract expressionism as a critique of capitalism, and in writing that he drew on a kind of utopian socialist tradition of non-capitalist, non-industrial forms of labour, so that there's this curious there's this curious event of socialists particularly in France and in Great Britain, but particularly in Wales, and in fact coming from the town where my family originate, which is Robertmowin in Newtown in Wales. Then going to North America to set up societies where they would escape from capitalism, industrialization and so forth, and set up utopias and based on their own self-governance and so on and so forth. And I'm wondering to what extent the ideas behind that escape from capitalism belong also to the critique of settler capitalism within your position. You see what I mean?
I think so. So I'd argue those utopian communities that settled kind of in North America on Turtle Island, are reproducing the same settler logics of those, very puritanical religious sects that settled, centuries before, and create the institutions that become the United States and then become Canada as settler nation states. There's a very similar logic there, and one that doesn't understand the privilege and power of the expropriation of Indigenous lands that go into that. So I would, as creating a foundational critique, I think that's there. In terms of my own thought, I think that clearly those are all linking together. Clearly, David's thought, if mine is, divulges in many spaces, is clearly integrated into how I see the world. I came up in crusty punk anarchist circles, and so making zines and things of that. So my understanding of the world comes from that non-state form of self-directed government, which is very similar to the band structure of many Indigenous peoples in my part of the world, including us as Métis peoples, where for Western Métis on the Prairie, the form of governance was around the buffalo hunt, which was a democratized way of redistributing wealth, and kind of in the Great Lakes communities, it was around basically kind of community kinship ties tied to participation in and against the fur trade. Again, going back to the book you might be reading from, if you participate in the structure, I mean, utopian thinking plays itself out, and there's actually a chapter or a section in it where I think about utopia is not in a very kind of rudimentary sense, but think about utopias as a dialectical space where tensions are played out for the creation of new cultures, if not this imaginary perfect world. It's kind of dialectical, and I've been thinking through in another way what an Indigenous dialectic is and or would be kind of against the capitalist and colonial. So all these things are in there, and I'm also somebody who's worked with the industrial workers of the world. I'm a former Wobbly, and the Wobblies were an early 19th century labor union, still active today, but kind of come from a anarcho-syndicalist tradition. In other places of the world, they kind of were seen as the OBU, or the one big union, thinking about organizing workers at the site of production as a way to dismantle the power of the capitalist. And one of the things you see is in the early 20th century in the US and in Canada is those were those were some of the most radical spaces against the capitalist and the nation state. And just this summer I did a project, and another one of my mentors, a printmaker named Carlos Cortez Coyocuicat, who was working with the IWW in the mid-1960s, 70s, 80s, 90s until his passing. He was a Chicano, an Indigenous identified Chicano printmaker. But we see that that's one of the most radical, multiracial spaces, because they were allowing and kind of organizing non-skilled workers, Indigenous workers, immigrant workers. And this summer I did a project in Detroit looking at that history in that city. So again, I'm not really responding to it, but I think that all of these are clearly linked and articulated in ways that go back to traditional knowledge. I think that's I'm at a point where there's concepts and practices in Indigenous languages, in our language, in Anishinaabemowin and in Michif, that articulate some of these thoughts. And using those and employing those becomes a particular way of responding to and against those institutions.
Thanks, Dave.
Thank you for a very, very interesting talk. I would like to ask about the small detail you ended with, the birch. Can you tell a little bit more about the birch, and is there a name of the birch in the languages and so on?
Yeah, so the word is wigwas, and if you've ever heard, I mean, you've probably heard, but people talk about native structures as wigwams. That word wigwam is basically from the word wigwas, which has to do with a building covered in birch. So for me, there's 2 times in the year to harvest. One is about the first week of July for summer bark, and the other is sometime in March. And if you harvest in those times, you don't do damage. Historically, an image I didn't show is I've been working for a number of years with youth in Nequejong, the urban native community I live in, to build a 12-meter birch bark canoe, and working with an elder to do that. So harvesting a few hundred sheets of bark. If you do it at the right time of year, you won't hurt the tree. If you do it the wrong time of year, you'll do damage. So there's something kind of about one's relationship with the trees and with the territory. Something that, again, I'm sure others are attentive to this as well, but when you're engaged in whether it's making syrup from maple trees, or harvesting bark, or kind of engaged in these practices, you begin to see quite intimately and immediately the effects of climate change. So when it becomes time to harvest the bark, you know, I've already seen it move earlier in June. The sugar season has definitely changed in the last 5 or 10 years based on, you know, changing climates. So those are things that I'm seeing kind of just as a kind of participant in these community practices. Is there anything specifically you're thinking about in terms of birch bark, or?
No, I was just curious. Coming from the East, where the birch is sort of such a symbol, so practice it, the name of the birch. I mean, Celtic alphabet starts with Beth-Louisian. It's a name. The birch is the first letter, and so I was just interested in if there are any mythologies or practices, or is the birch important in any other way than or well, it was fine what you said, but just because sometimes some cultures, of course, are centered around certain animals or plants, or they become sort of important in many ways. That's why I asked.
And so kind of when I was talking during the talk, I mentioned there's traditional stories about how the birch got its marks, which have to do with the thunder beings getting mad and trying to catch an animal that was hiding there. And so that's, you know, the marks on the birch tree have to do with the lightnings coming down from the thunder beings and marking and damaging the tree. But there's all, you know, so there's those sorts of things. Whenever you harvest, then you're also kind of linking in with the thunder beings and thinking in this way. You know, there's also one of the medicines that I showed there is in English it's called chaga. So there's stories that circulate around chaga. We would call it shikatagan. It's kind of used, and it's a fungus that grows on birch. So there's stories that revolve around that. It's kind of usually in people's fire bags as well. So there's kind of linkages in all of these situations. Yeah.
Benjamin?
Hi, and thanks for that fascinating talk. I was really interested in your mapping and cartography, especially you had a couple really interesting slides there. You had a Sugar Island slide, and then you also had a really interesting kind of, you put the context of Google Maps and then this historical reference. So I would love any kind of discursive talk about what you're going there and depictions, kind of visual depictions of that. And also, I'm just going to say, just as an aside, I was really intrigued by your, when you were talking about the pipeline and the Mackinac Straits and tying that to Standing Rock, and I'm just wondering, is there like some kind of cartography of pipelines on Indigenous lands in the United States? And if there is, I would love to learn more about that. Thanks.
Sure. So multiple thinkings about cartography. You know, I'm not trained as a cartographer or geographer, but I think about, you know, the intimate relationships between Indigenous peoples and our relationship with the land, and the ways that there's different kind of alternative mapping systems. So one of those that I articulate in other locations is this notion of low riding, where I use kind of the process of slow movement through, and thinking about lowrider cars and lowrider bicycles, which is an indigenous practice within Chicano communities in California and New Mexico, as the relationship with place, and what does it mean to slowly move through and relate to territory as you're actually walking, which is a very different relationship to place than happens in capitalism, where you're quickly moving through, as much as I like to move slowly through, I flew here and I'm here for, 72 or 48 hours, and right, responding to the necessities of the capitalist world. So I would say that there are alternative ways of marking the world and understanding our place and presence in it, and I would say though these are indigenous forms of cartography. One of my ancestors is noted in history books as being tattooed from head to toe with curious figures. There's no images of what these are, but in stories with other scholars and with community members, it's believed that these are actually articulations of travels and relationships to place. And so whether one marks their body as a form of making maps, or in terms of the last question about birch bark and wigwas, in the Great Lakes, and I know in other parts of the Northern Hemisphere, right, maps are made, and they're sacred ceremonial maps that are made in etched birch bark. They're the birch bark scrolls of the Anishinaabe, and they tell migration stories, and they tell Indigenous ceremonial stories on these scrolls, which were then collected and exist in colonial institutions like in Washington, D.C. So for me, that trying to understand these different ways, historically, contemporarily, of marking land, whether that, again, where I come from, people would bend trees as well as a way of marking a territory. Marking on sites, on petroglyphs and what's the other one? Petroglyphs and the other kind of etchings into. But markings that way. In terms of pipeline, I'm sure you could find images, maps of pipelines in the relationship to both Indigenous reservation lands and treaty lands, and that's one of the things that was, I think, least talked about in relationship to Standing Rock, is that the pipeline, although not on the reservation boundaries, was actually on the boundary of a treaty sign that basically was never, the US stopped paying attention to that treaty and the boundaries of that treaty and created other treaty boundaries which were much smaller. So the pipeline actually was on the previous boundaries, but not on the most recent ones, based on their abrogation of earlier notions of territoriality. A colleague that I work with, Elizabeth LaPonce, has made a video game, and in that video game, she's actually used traditional stories, Ari Sokanak, those sacred stories which talk about the pipelines, and has mapped the pipelines, particularly from the tar sands in Alberta into the Great Lakes. And the way that actually, the actual course of those is of a serpent. And on the plains, that was one of the images that came up for Lakota peoples, Dakota peoples, was that the pipeline was a black serpent. That the pipeline was a serpent in that one, and that's why you see that imagery come up so much.
Does anyone else have any questions, comments, or observations you do make? I have one.
Thanks very much for a really complex presentation. I just wonder if I could maybe pick up a couple of key ideas that you initiated. You proposed an idea of sovereignty, and you connected this with a particular idea of art practice, of cultural practice, and that as the basis of a sovereignty. I'm just wondering if you could unpack that a little bit for us.
Sure. Yeah. So that's I think. In terms of contemporary Indigenous practices, two terms that are both problematic and used, and I'd say people go in various camps. One would be the application of aesthetics, and the other would be the application of sovereignty. What does it mean to integrate or to use, maybe to transform these two words which have various problematic histories? Aesthetics, of course, can it be removed from Kantian notions of the beautiful? Should we try? I would say yes, it can be, and yes, we should use it as a powerful assertion. When it comes to sovereignty, I think within Indigenous studies, in particular in relationship to artistic practices, there's two main opposing, potentially dialectic positions. One is that the sovereignty cannot be removed from the sovereign, which is a particular Western European polity, and therefore we should think about something else. On the other hand, and this is where I would fall, is that when we're talking about Indigenous sovereignty, or rather Indigenous sovereignties, we're talking about very different forms of polities, and the notion of sovereignty becomes shorthand to communicate self-governance and the mutual understanding of political and juridical power. So, from that perspective, I'm already using it in a way that I understand its limitations, I understand the problems it has, but decide to use it because it communicates in our moment in time something that's mutually intelligible. From that perspective, there are, particularly within North America, indigenous cultural practices and artistic traditions, people looking at the notion of indigenous aesthetic sovereignty or indigenous artistic sovereignty. The way that on one hand it's about people's naming and claiming and using those traditions they see fit, as also, and then from my perspective it's more about using those as ways that assert and redefine and continue older political formations that are above and beyond and outside the nation state. And I think that's, that's why the arts in this moment become more interesting to me, is that, what does it mean to think about political and juridical and indigenous sovereignty or sovereignties in ways that doesn't limit them to the nation state and or to the sovereign as, an imperial head.
That's really clear, and I just wonder, because I think it might relate to this question of the relationship with the land. And I know that when ideas of indigeneity are being problematized, it's often because of a particular way of reading this idea of the land and possession or relationship or with the land. So I was wondering if you could also maybe unpack that a little bit in the same spirit.
Yeah. And so I think at the core of your question is just the way that the nation state creates boundaries for where land cannot be mutually shared, that the boundaries of the nation state are clearly defined, right? And there's been some critiques, particularly in relationship. There are some native studies scholars 10, 20 years ago looking at Chicano or Mexican American assertions of indigeneity and this notion of aslan, which comes from Nahua or Mexica origin stories that say, Mexican peoples, indigenous Mexican peoples migrate south from this utopian, going back to the earlier question, this utopian space. It was an island with 7 caves and 7 peoples migrated out. And that became a way for Mexican American peoples to say, we're not immigrant peoples, our ancestors are from this land. It was colonized and taken over by the US. Previous to that, it was the Spanish, you have these multi-layered. So when we start to understand, or start to go beyond the notion that the sovereignty means the nation states and the geopolitical boundaries between them cannot be shared. When you start to think back to traditional land use practices, and even in the Great Lakes, right? There's where I'm from. There's the Anishinaabe is often talked about as the Three Fires Confederacy: Odawa, Ojibwa, and Potawatomi peoples. Lots of kin relationships. Territories were shared based on time of the year, based on use value. Different kind of bands would use them at different times. And so I think that as we problematize the notion of the nation state as a particular polity, and I always wonder, well, why is this the only political formation? We've moved into a time and place where there's no thinking about beyond the nation state as the primary polity, the primary form of governance. Yet, that's a fairly recent tradition that comes, in a kind of from France at a particular moment in time, and linked to all these other Western European historical and political formations. Territory can be shared. Right? That doesn't mean that, in indigenous, like pre-colonial and colonial North America, there weren't kind of long and violent battles between people for territory. But at other times, spaces were shared. So if we can think above, beyond, past the nation state as the only form of polity, we can start to think through some of this. And I would argue that Glenn Coulthard, who is a Dene political scientist from the Canadian Arctic, teaches in Vancouver, wrote a beautiful book called Red Skin, White Mask, kind of paying homage to Fanon's wonderful and important anti-colonial work. But he actually argues against trying to get nation-state, settler nation-state recognition. That's actually been a violence to Indigenous peoples to try to get approval from, whether it's the Canadian nation-state or the US nation-state, to recognize their form of self-governance, because then it only goes through kind of these colonial juridical systems to then approve itself. And thinking of the conversation we may have in regards to Adam Cooper's Return of the Native, right? Clearly not understanding these sorts of things, non-European juridical formations, non-European political formations, and how territoriality is not simply based on kind of the sedimentation of a particular border as not shared.
There's an easy one out you have to move very from it.
Thank you for your presentation. In connection to what you were discussing right now, what do you think of the potential of the commons as an alternative to the expansion of private property?
Sure. I think that I think it's a beautiful idea. There's a settler Canadian poet and literary scholar, I'm forgetting his name right now, but has discussed harvesting of blackberries as a form of the commons. And actually, he makes the argument, and if someone asks me later, I can Google it and remind myself who said this. But he makes the argument that poetry and harvesting of berries are this form of the commons, that it's a shared. It's shared, and I mean, his argument is that nobody makes money off poetry. Publishers aren't making money. The writers themselves aren't making money. In the same way that harvesting of blackberries, nobody buys them at supermarkets. They're harvested in these spaces that, regardless of if private property law protects them, that they should be shared. And I mean, I think this is potentially where you have a slight distinction between Western and Northern, particularly kind of Nordic countries, which have an understanding of harvesting rights and the commons, which don't become reproduced in any substantial way in the US and or Canada. And when you layer on top of that the very powerful realities of ongoing expropriation of Indigenous lands, it's an additional layer. So I think that the commons is an important way to think about it, but it's also been being brought up in North America by white activists who aren't understanding kind of the very nuanced and layered histories of expropriation of lands and what that means in relationship to the commons, right?
Does anyone else have any questions or comments for Dylan? Okay, I'd like to ask you something which I haven't really thought through particularly well, but I want to position it in relation to a quote also from Berger. So Berger states in Ways of Seeing, which you obviously cited throughout the latter part of your presentation, the relation between what we see and what we know is never settled. I want to ask you something about the relationship between settler logic and settlement. And settlement in the sense, twofold really, of but of other modes of temporality. So I guess, so towards the question at least would be, what are the potentialities of this notion of temporality to the sense of settlement, whether it be of paying debt that is supposed debt that is being provided through a kind of capitalist mechanism, or to reach some form of agreement, and in what sense may temporalities beyond the kind of Western notion of past, present, and future inform how that might be conducted.
Well, let me see if I can on the spot think through that. Lots there. So to begin with, as you're talking about settling and unsettling, I started thinking about the ways that scholars and activists are many of whom kind of in communities I operate are thinking about unsettling settler colonialism as a way of dismantling, thinking of the unsettlement as kind of not coming to agreement and kind of undermining and doing away with those institutions. So as we, as I try to imagine, a beyond, and maybe this gets to the core here, and as I'm speaking, please do respond. I teach a course at university, a senior seminar for graduating undergraduates called Beyond Capitalism. And we begin with the proposition, can we imagine a world beyond capitalism or outside of capitalism? And having taught this a number of times, it's shocking that we come to the conclusion at the end that nobody can imagine. They can't imagine a world beyond, before, after, outside of, because of maybe going back to Anishinaabemowin's coloniality of power, the matrix of power, that it is in fact so encompassing, it is the totality that we can't think beyond it. Of course, these are primarily students, coming from kind of, dominant mainstream white and Euro-American positions who haven't grown up with other ways of being in the world. So with that in mind, I think that, I've been struggling to think about ways of being and thinking about responding to settler colonialism in ways that don't privilege the presence of that system. So on one hand, I have concerns with decoloniality as a structure because it privileges at all times the notion of the colonial. It becomes a response. Yet it isn't, for me, it doesn't go far enough. It isn't anti, it's just, it's an option. And I've written this elsewhere that, the decoloniality, according to Mignolo, there's the decolonial option. It's an option amongst many. And from an Indigenous perspective, I'd say it's not an option, it's the only option. There is no other option besides contesting and responding to the colonial and capitalist structures. Because if we don't, there will be no, shared humanity, moving forward in the future. What does that mean? And again, then I just kind of collapsed and kind of moved backward into this linear notion of time. But if for me, and I don't think I said it in the talk today, within many Indigenous communities in North America, you've probably heard this, there's often it becomes one of these knowledge nuggets that's extracted from any real meaning and kind of, it is used ad hominem, but there's talks of the 7 generations, meaning that, and it comes from Haudenosaunee folks, but it's also, you see it in Anishinaabeg and Métis communities, that when there's any planning going on, you plan forward and backwards 7 generations. And that unless you know and can kind of talk about your knowledge lineage 7 generations backward and forward, then you can never come to a sustainable present. So as you're thinking about this notion of settlements and about settling and unsettling, I start thinking about this. I start thinking kind of the intra and transgenerational relationship of knowledge, and if something was, it can be, because the past is not something behind, it's also something in the future. That the future isn't something simply behind, in the future, it's in front of, but it's also behind. So if we break down the linearity, we can see that these things have been and will be.
Thank you. And as we just continue for a second on this, as somebody who identified themselves early on as both sort of art historian, sort of artist, etc., in what ways do those kinds of frameworks or visions of temporalities begin to sort of play with this notion of sort of history making and an art historian sort of implicit relations to the sense of chronicle?
So 2 things come to mind in response. One is the notion of the prefigurative, and prefiguration or prefigurative politics comes, at least as I understand it, from social movements, the sociology of social movements, and that particularly those anarchist and kind of non-state social movements in the 70s and 80s that kind of imagined better worlds and can can't fully undermine or do away with the larger social structures. So just imagine that world lived that way. And I think that Indigenous communities have always been doing this. There's always the implications of the nation state. There's always the implications of global capitalism and the various hierarchies that those institutions have. Yet communities have always imagined a historical and a future world above, beyond, outside of that. So there's that. As going back to the kind of written or kind of the art historical artist practice, I'm shocked at the way, and I've been that just the notion of alphabetic script creates a certain form of linear temporality, even when the text itself tries to do away with that. That alphabetic script kind of forces you to read through it in a way which has a linear temporal structure to it. That I would say, as an artist, as a visual artist, as someone engaged in various practices, that those practices cannot engage with temporality in the same way. So critiques of some of my writing, often coming from anthropologists, is that I somehow move back and forth between various centuries as if they were hours or days apart. And for readers, it can be a disjointed kind of sort of read, because I move across different spaces and times, very disparate ones at times, in ways that don't make sense to the rational thought that the reader, particularly anthropologists, want to see. So as I'm kind of moving out, this is, I think, in some ways, while I've been writing in academic ways less and less frequently, and making more and more art and writing more and more kind of poetic texts, because for me it feels that they're less encumbered by the alphabetic constraints of temporality that writing unfortunately has.
Thank you. Are there any other questions or comments or? Okay. Thank you so much for your generosity, Dylan. Thank you.
Hi, we were going to relocate to the glass house before lunch because we have some packs there for people in connection with the Strand.